There was no sign of a struggle. No graves. No wreckage. Just an empty settlement, packed up with unusual care, and one word carved into a post, Croatoan. In 1587, 115 English men, women, and children established a colony on the coast of what's now North Carolina. This was decades before Jamestown. Decades before the Mayflower. When a supply ship finally made it back 3 years later, every one of them was gone. The settlement itself didn't look like a place people had fled. It looked, in almost every documented detail, like a place people had deliberately left. Here's what actually happened, as far as the historical record allows. By the 1580s, England was making its first real attempts to establish a permanent colony in North America, under charters granted by Queen Elizabeth I to Sir Walter Raleigh. There had already been one attempt on this exact site, Roanoke Island, in 1585, an all-male military expedition that ended badly. That earlier group's presence had already damaged relations with the local Algonquian-speaking communities, including violent conflict the English themselves had instigated. The 1587 expedition was different in a way that matters enormously to this story. Roughly 115 settlers sailed this time, and unlike the earlier military group, this included entire families, women, children, people intending to actually live there, not just hold a military position. They sailed under the leadership of John White, an artist and experienced member of the earlier Roanoke voyages, now appointed governor of the new colony. White's own daughter, Eleanor Dare, and her husband Ananias Dare were among the settlers. Shortly after landing, Eleanor gave birth to a daughter, Virginia Dare, the first English child known to have been born anywhere in the Americas, born on Roanoke Island in August of 1587. The colony was in a difficult position from the very start. They'd actually intended to settle further north, in the Chesapeake Bay area, a better location by most accounts. But the ship's pilot refused to take them any further than Roanoke, for reasons historians still debate, possibly tied to a dispute over privateering opportunities elsewhere. So they were forced to resettle on an island already carrying the weight of prior English violence against the people who lived there. That tension wasn't abstract. The 1587 colonists inherited real, unresolved hostility from the earlier expedition, including the killing of a Roanoke leader named Wingina by the previous English garrison. Within days of the new colonists' arrival, one of them, George Howe, was killed by local warriors, directly tied to that unresolved conflict. This wasn't a peaceful blank slate. The danger these people were living with from day one was real, documented, and had nothing to do with whatever would happen 3 years later. And here's the detail that shapes the entire structure of this mystery: John White wasn't there when it happened. Within weeks of the colony's founding, after his granddaughter's birth, the colonists asked him to sail back to England to secure more supplies and reinforcements. He was the one person positioned to make their case back home. He agreed. He didn't want to go. The colonists asked him to, because he was the one person who could make the case back in England for more support. He left his own daughter and 9-day-old granddaughter behind, expecting to be back within months. He wasn't gone months. He was gone 3 years. And the reason had nothing to do with abandonment. White arrived back in England in late 1587, right as tensions with Spain were escalating toward what would become the Spanish Armada's attempted invasion in 1588. Queen Elizabeth ordered every available ship in England conscripted for national defense. It became illegal for White to charter a vessel to sail back to Roanoke. He did try anyway. In 1588, he managed to secure passage on 2 small vessels, but their crews were more interested in privateering against Spanish shipping than in a resupply mission, and the ships themselves were attacked and looted at sea. White was forced back to England, empty-handed, further delayed, no closer to Roanoke than when he'd started. It would be 3 full years before he could organize and fund a return voyage. 3 years driven by war, not neglect, but no less devastating for the people waiting on that island with absolutely no way of knowing why help hadn't come. He finally departed again in 1590. His ship arrived off the coast near Roanoke on August 18, Virginia Dare's 3rd birthday. He'd been gone 3 years instead of the few months he'd promised. He arrived on his granddaughter's 3rd birthday. And the fire they'd seen from the ship the night before had already gone out by the time they reached land. That's not embellishment, that's from White's own written account. The night before landing, his crew spotted what looked like a signal fire on the shore. Rough seas and dangerous conditions kept them from reaching land until the next day. By the time the landing party finally made it ashore, the fire was out, and no one has ever been able to say for certain whether it had been a colonist signal or something else entirely. White's landing party followed the beach toward where the settlement should have been, not yet knowing what they were walking toward. What White found, in his own words, was a settlement that had been carefully dismantled, not destroyed. The fort and houses had been taken apart in a way he himself described as deliberate and unhurried, not the aftermath of a sudden attack or a panicked flight. Heavy items the colonists couldn't have carried with them were found dug up and scattered: iron bars, a small cannon, and White's own personal belongings that he'd buried before leaving in 1587, books, maps, pieces of armor. But based on White's own assessment at the time, this damage looked like it had happened after the colonists left, likely from weather or scavenging over 3 years, not evidence of what had happened to the people themselves. There was nothing investigators would expect from either a massacre or a rescue gone wrong. No bodies. No graves. No bloodstains, no broken weapons, nothing suggesting a fight. No debris consistent with a hurried, forced evacuation either. What there was a single word. The letters CRO carved into a tree. And separately, the full word, Croatoan, carved into a post of the fort. Here's why that detail matters as much as it does. Before White left in 1587, he'd arranged a specific signal with the colonists. If they had to relocate, and if that relocation happened under distress or attack, they were to carve a cross above wherever they'd written where they'd gone. There was no cross. Croatoan was the name of a nearby island, in the area of what's now Hatteras Island, and of the Croatoan people, an Algonquian-speaking community the colonists had maintained a comparatively better relationship with than most others nearby. Before White ever left for England, the colonists had specifically discussed the possibility of relocating there if conditions on Roanoke worsened. Based on the absence of a distress cross, White believed, in his own writing, that the colonists had relocated deliberately, and safely, to Croatoan. He intended to sail there directly and find them. He had a plan. He believed he knew exactly where to look. And a storm took that away from him before he ever got the chance to try. That same night, a violent storm damaged his ship's anchor cables. Several sailors were lost trying to secure the vessels. The ship's surviving crew and captain, citing the damage, dwindling supplies, and how late in the season it was for a safe Atlantic crossing, refused to continue the search. White was forced to return to England without ever reaching Croatoan. Without ever confirming the one theory he believed in. He never got another chance. He never returned to Roanoke, or to Croatoan, again. Funding for further search efforts kept falling through amid England's ongoing war with Spain. John White died years later in Ireland, having never learned what happened to his daughter, his son-in-law, or his granddaughter. For centuries, that was where the case stood. A carved word. A theory its own author never got to confirm. Nothing more. But the mystery has actually moved, in the years since, through real research, not speculation. The oldest and longest-standing theory, taken seriously since White's own era, is that the colonists relocated to Croatoan and, over time, genuinely integrated with the community there. Decades later, other English explorers in the region reported local indigenous people with gray eyes, ancestors described as being able to talk in a book, meaning read, and in some accounts, people who claimed English ancestry consistent with descent from the lost colonists. More recently, archaeological work has given that theory real physical support. Excavations on Hatteras Island, beginning in the 1990s and continuing through recent seasons, led notably by researchers with the First Colony Foundation, have recovered English-made artifacts from the correct time period: a signet ring, gun parts, European ceramics, all found mixed directly among Croatoan settlement layers and artifacts. Not a brief visit. Something that looks like sustained contact, or integration. There's a second theory too, and it's not necessarily in conflict with the first. Rather than relocating as one unified group, the colonists may have split, some going to Croatoan, others moving further inland or north toward other allied communities. This is supported by second-hand reports collected decades later by the Jamestown colonists in the early 1600s, including from Captain John Smith, describing rumors of English-looking people living among interior tribes. There's a specific, genuinely sobering piece of evidence tied to that theory. Jamestown accounts recorded reports that a powerful regional leader, Powhatan, had ordered the killing of a group of Roanoke survivors living among an allied tribe, shortly before the Jamestown colonists arrived in 1607. It's second-hand. It's unverified. But historians take it seriously precisely because it was recorded independently, years later, by people who had no reason to invent it. None of this is proof, and it's worth being honest about that. No DNA evidence, no archaeological finding to date has conclusively connected any specific modern population directly to the 1587 colonists. The Hatteras artifacts are compelling, but they don't by themselves prove the entire colony survived and integrated there. The Powhatan account remains second-hand. But here's the detail that, for me, is the strangest and most genuinely remarkable turn the whole case has taken. White drew a map. Then he covered part of it with a patch, deliberately, in a way that wasn't discovered until modern imaging technology found it, more than 400 years later. Underneath it was a symbol for a fort, at a location no other record of the colony ever mentioned. In 2012, researchers examining an old map White himself had drawn, held in the British Museum for centuries, used modern imaging technology and found a hidden mark beneath a patch that had, at some point, been deliberately placed over part of the map. Underneath it was a symbol matching a fort design, at a specific inland location roughly 50 miles from Roanoke. A site no other surviving record of the colony ever mentions. Nobody knows for certain why White covered it, or when, or what it means. But it sat there, in an archive, for over 300 years, waiting for someone to look closely enough. There's still no single, universally accepted answer to what happened to all 115 colonists. It remains one of the oldest open questions in American history. Archaeological work continues, the First Colony Foundation and other researchers are still excavating, still refining the working theory that the colonists likely dispersed among multiple allied communities rather than vanishing as a single group. It's worth saying plainly, too, since it's often left out of the popular version of this story, descendant communities of the Croatoan and related Algonquian peoples exist today, including the modern Lumbee and other regional tribes, some of whom carry oral traditions connecting their ancestry to this exact period. Which reframes the whole story, a little. Maybe this was never really a vanishing. Maybe it was an integration into communities that never disappeared at all. The most significant clue in the entire case wasn't found on Roanoke Island, or on Hatteras Island, or anywhere in the woods where 115 people disappeared. It was sitting in an archive in London, hidden under a piece of paper, on a map their own governor drew with his own hand. For 400 years, nobody thought to look underneath it.